This sixth episode of Red Pens and Red Flags was profound for me. It featured a raw and candid conversation with two professionals working in alternative education, Kaitlen Green, a social worker, and Jennifer Jones, a school district administrator, principal. The discussion centered around the threats posed by Project 2025, the erosion of DEI principles, funding cuts, and how political decisions are placing marginalized students at risk. Both guests highlight the reality on the ground: fear, trauma, and uncertainty, while holding on to a shared hope found in the resilience of their students. Ms. Green stated something that countered what previous podcast guest Erin Magrian said about discipline. She says, this stick approach to discipline does not address the thoughts and feelings that are driving the behavior in the first place. Something to think about. Both ladies expressed alarm over the plan to replace progressive education policies with politically motivated agendas. And there is concern that shifting power to states will lead to funding disparities, especially for students requiring special education or language support. These women fear the rollback of DEI and that it will harm LGBTQ+, Black and disabled students. Ms. Green stated, "My worry is that this pipeline, school to prison, is going to get huge." Another great comment came from Ms. Jones. We do not all start from the same starting place. To be human in this world is to be a person who understands the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We discussed the impact of mental health, trauma, unpredictability, and lack of community resources that are contributing to escalating behaviors in schools. Ms. Green had a positive comment about this that I want to mention. She said, we do get a reward from trauma, and that we get tools. The things that have happened in their lives can actually serve a purpose. The current climate has administrators and staff in a constant state of reactivity rather than proactive support. Ms. Jones said, we're putting systems in place that disproportionately impact our most vulnerable students and pretending that it's neutral? What? This episode was my favorite. Welcome to Red Pens and Red Flags, the podcast that's not afraid to grade the current state of American education. My name is Rictor Riolo, a grad student knee-deep in the world of teaching, technology, and just trying to stay out of the principal's office. How unlucky for me, because today I'm actually in the principal's office. Today I'm joined by admin Jennifer Jones.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And also a social worker, Kaitlen Green.
Greetings.
Hi, thank you both for joining me today. Let's jump right in. Jennifer Jones, describe what you're an admin of and how it benefits students.
I am the district administrator for alternative educational options in a small urban school district. My role is to serve students in grades 6 through 12 in a variety of programs that haven't been successful in the comprehensive educational system. And we benefit students by providing them options. We benefit the district by retaining students who might otherwise drop out.
And Kaitlen Green, how about you?
My current role is a social worker in an alternative education high school setting. And I work with students with high trauma impacts, situations where students have either been pushed out of their comprehensive high schools or had experiences that didn't meet their needs. And here in our program, we work diligently on wrapping services around these students to promote success and ultimately get to that graduation.
Project 2025 and the Department of Education's impact with its shuttering. Are you both familiar with Project 2025? And if so, what are your initial reactions or concerns?
I am familiar with Project 2025, at least as familiar as you can be with a 900-page document. I understand the bullet points. My initial concerns with Project 2025 is the very clear mandate, directive, plan, strategy to replace opposing political ideas with political ideals that align with the current administration.
And Kaitlen, what about you?
I am familiar, not as familiar as I could be, but my biggest concern is if we're going to be taking from one area, what are we replacing it with, and how do we support students with these high needs?
We have the benefit of living in a blue state. How do you think state-level control has historically impacted marginalized communities in education? Kaitlen, I'll go with you first.
That's a big question, honestly, and I think that there's a lot of impacts that's happened along the way. One of probably my bigger concerns are understanding who and the population is being served, what population is being served, having an understanding with who's on the ground floor, who and what needs are there within that. I don't believe gets seen necessarily at state levels. We've had, Oregon in particular has had a very rocky history with racial equity and the impacts of race. And I believe that's hugely an oversight within our government. That makes a big impact.
So, Oregon is a really complex state. It is a blue state, primarily controlled by its urban centers. Population centers are very liberal, surrounded by very rural communities that have a history of very direct racist policies that we are dealing with, as my colleague mentioned previously, to this day. Another thing that takes place in Oregon that I have some opinions about is we have a two-legged tax system. So the way that the state funds education ebbs and flows depending on revenue taken in by income tax and property tax. And there is no sales tax, which means that our revenue streams are constantly swinging, and we experience that on the ground in education in terms of what gets funded and what doesn't get funded depending on the biennium.
Jennifer, do you see any positives in giving back power to the states in how they handle public education?
You mean if the federal government was to release the responsibilities that they have back to the state?
Yes.
Oh, positives. That's a difficult one for me to think about right now. Right now, the federal government sends funds for students with special education through IDEA and supports our multi-language learners. If that funding was to be, if those departments were to return to the responsibility of the state, I wonder where that money comes from. That's a huge question for me. We would be robbing Peter to pay Paul in order to be able to support those students in our communities. I think in Oregon, if the state had the revenue to be able to manage those programs, I would have confidence in our ability to continue to serve students here. However, I get very concerned about inequities in other states. Washington is just across the way. They also happen to be blue, but so is Idaho. So if the federal Department of Education is dissolved and those revenue streams come back to Oregon and we figure out a way to pay for it, I'm confident. If those revenue streams go away and I live in Idaho and I have a child with special needs, I'm incredibly concerned.
When it comes to English language development and students requiring additional resources, what are the incentives for students at the moment in middle school?
Well, if you're in English language development program, there's an assumption that you're still acquiring English as a communication tool, both verbally and in written communication. The benefits for ELD in middle school is that you continue to get sheltered instruction to make sure that you have the academic language necessary to navigate your academic classes. As you get older, though, and you continue to have those ELD support classes and haven't passed out of those classes, you lose opportunities to take elective courses and have some some choice in terms of what direction you want to go in high school. And the way that you pass out of those classes is by passing a state test called the ELPA. And there's some questions about whether or not that's a relevant assessment. There's questions about whether or not students take that test seriously, and and what is the actual purpose of that? Is that a compliance test so that the state can say we're testing this many kids and this many kids are completing? But having students feel like that's a relevant assessment is a challenge. As opposed to the ELPA, there are other language proficiency assessments that students can take that actually demonstrate not a deficit, like you haven't passed out of English language proficiency courses yet, but actually proficiency. So students can take something called the STAMP test, which offers them the seal of biliteracy, where they can have a certificate that indicates that they are fully biliterate in one or more languages. They can also take the foreign language assessment test and demonstrate that same level of proficiency and earn credit. So much more relevant assessment when you're talking about a student getting a chance to prove their language proficiency and earn something with that, rather than I'm going to take this test and if I don't pass it, I got to stick in these classes for the rest of the foreseeable future.
I would be adding on to that. I think that there's value in meeting kiddos where they're at with stepping into a foreign language and attempting to incorporate two languages at once while you're presenting information and stretching your learning muscles. There's something to be said about building up confidence in your academia, in pursuing goals, and having that extra layer of support, especially in a time where there's so much change in an individual student's life, physiologically, physically. I think that it's also important to remember that there's an element of support that's built in there for their own mental health.
Kaitlen, I want you to paint a picture for me. As a social worker, tell me what your day-to-day job would be like without ELD resources and dual language inclusion with your students. How much harder would it be, or easier?
I think that the real question is what are we evaluating? Are we evaluating the English language here with kiddos? Or are we looking at what they're learning in their learning objectives in school? And we've had in the past a couple of students who are new to the country being able to reflect their true intellect and their capabilities and their academic just successes through the limited amount of language that they know can be a real detriment to reflecting, again, to the learning objectives in the classroom. So, for example, we had a student who would write her essays in Spanish and then have them translated through Google Translate to submit to the teacher. And what this allowed them to do was to free flow their thoughts, their actual insights, their ability to grasp the concepts in the classroom and reflect those back to the teacher. They also had the ability then to collaborate with the teacher to go over the Google Translate to really talk about what was accurately translated or inaccurately translated through that particular program. So it also created an opportunity to collaborate with teachers directly and show that learning that has happened.
We're now going to be moving into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Kaitlen, do you consider yourself DEI?
Very much so. I think that's some of the foundation of social work is the aspect of inclusion and trying to understand equity and how it applies to a massive amount of diversity that is in schools.
And what about you, Jenny?
Do I consider myself DEI? I'm white. And so I always have to acknowledge the impact of my own race and culture on the interactions that I bring to my students and staff. And I'm absolutely pro diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't know how you can't be and live in this world. This is a world where there are people that are included and not included. We do not all start from the same starting place. So I think that to be human in this world is to be a person who understands the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
What do you think schools will look like 5 to 10 years from now if the current trends continue?
So having been in public education in the state of Oregon for 25 years, I have ridden the waves of a lack of funding streams growing and disappearing and shrinking and hiring and laying off teachers over and over and over again, depending on where the revenue is and who's in office. Different initiatives, whether it be Smarter Balanced or Sim and Cam, if you're from the early 2000s. The thing that's frightening to me about this particular situation is our current administration has given permission to people to objectively discriminate against certain populations in our community. And that is one of the things that I'm concerned about in terms of the trajectory of education in the next 5 years. And the other thing that I think my social worker colleague can probably speak to more eloquently than I can is that this current administration has a brilliant way of creating fear. It's a very tenuous place to try to make plans for the future. There's no predictability in what's coming out of the administration. There are lots of threats. There's lots of rescinding of threats. The rule of law has been compromised. And so it's very murky territory. I don't know how to move forward necessarily in a way that I might have known in times when things were lean in the past. So it's just shaky ground. So I don't know. That's the most challenging thing for me right now as an administrator. I don't know what it's going to look like in 5 years.
Before you jump in, Kaitlen, I want to follow up with you. You said you've been in education for 25 years. So you started when No Child Left Behind was coming into power.
Yes.
Compare that to what's happening today.
No Child Left Behind, there was a reason behind it. Whether you agreed with it or not, there was a rational thinking behind the idea of we want all children, no matter where they live, to have access to the same level of education. And the way that we're going to create that compliance across state to state is to have standardized test measures that force teachers and education departments to teach a particular standard. Louisiana, Oregon, Texas, Alaska. It rolled out in chaos and had all kinds of unintended consequences like many federal programs do, but at least there was some reason behind it. This, again, finding reason, ration, logic behind the orders that are coming from our current administration is completely, it's just, I can't understand it. I don't understand what's happening. Well, I understand what's happening. It appears to be about ego and about power and about money, but it makes it very unpredictable.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with a lot of that. I also believe that there is a culture of fear that's been cast around a lot of trauma impacts that's happened in, the last 5 years between the outcome of COVID and our political state and ever-changing political temperature, and it impacts different groups in different kinds of ways. I would definitely say I see there's a lot of it within the administration, a lot of reaction versus responsiveness. And that is a very concerning place to be because, again, not having the forethought to slow down, take a deep breath, and really begin to look at what the root issues are of the behaviors that are escalating in our communities around us. There's so many different traumas that are on the rise, and how we're responding as a community to those things and how the school systems are responding to those things is scary. Resources are getting cut back. Community is getting shaved down more and more. And in that process, that reactivity allows for emotional responses to situations that require more thought and investment into, again, what are the triggers to this trauma in the first place. And with the inconsistency in this state with funding, the rise and fall of never knowing, what resources we will have next year. Will there be mental health referrals I'm able to make? Are there agencies that are taking new clients? Those type of situations completely impact our kids. And then as administrators who are attempting to, quote unquote, control their environment, it feels very out of control. And so the reaction begins to escalate, and that's where harm is created.
Kaitlen, what do teachers and students need most right now?
There's a lot of things that are needed. I think grace is super important at this time in our lives, understanding that we are in an environment that's ever changing and it's hard to navigate. Having grace for each other, community is something that is super important. I have been living this motto this year, especially the community is where healing happens. So coming together in community and attempting to find those bonds within a school setting and creating those relationships is super important at this time.
What do students and teachers need most right now? So as an administrator, I think for teachers, clarity. So in a very unclear time, I try to be as transparent and clear with them as I can be, letting them know what I know and what I don't know. I don't need them to ride the waves with me, but I need them to know that I'm aware and that I'm moving the ship forward. And then for students, I feel like I'm getting a visual around protection. I need them to know that they're safe here, that I will protect them here in this community no matter what, and that they can show up here in all their LGBTQ glory, speaking whatever language they speak at home, with whatever political beliefs they have, with whatever pronouns they have, and that I will protect them from the outside.
Yesterday, the Washington Post stated there is a legal pushback from the courts regarding Project 2025's efforts to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, initiatives in schools. Federal judges in Maryland, New Hampshire, and Washington, D.C. did that. Jennifer, what are your thoughts on this regarding Project 2025 getting pushback from the courts?
This is our hope right now. I think although the court system takes an enormous amount of time, I think states being bold enough to risk their funding to stand up and file lawsuits against some of these executive orders from the Trump administration are clearing the pathway to putting at least a pause on some of these initiatives. I read the same article yesterday, and my one concern is, Trump has continued to, or his administration, has continued to replace judges willy-nilly and dismantle our checks and balances judicial system. But the states are standing up and filing these suits, and I'm proud to be in a state where our superintendent just signed a very similar letter to Washington, D.C., letting them know that we will not be complying until they give us a real reason.
I think ultimately it gives a foreshadowing of hope. Oftentimes, I believe, when you're talking about ground level students, their voices feel like it's not heard. There's not an opportunity to amplify particular perspectives. And it really felt very daunting at first with all of these swift changes that are happening to know an outlet where a voice could be elevated. So I think this is an opportunity of shedding hope amongst the trauma and the impacts of swift political choices.
As Kaitlen was speaking, I was reminded of the famous Mr. Rogers anecdote where he would talk to the children about in times of disaster, look for the helpers. Yeah. And I guess, we'll chuck Marilyn up as a helper.
The Oregon Education Association has expressed opposition to the Project 2025 agenda, emphasizing the importance of equitable educational opportunities and access to critical resources for all students. The school that you oversee receives 10% funding from the federal government based on it being a public school. What kind of effect would that have on your institution and students if that money, that 10%, were taken away?
So the federal government does provide 8 to 10% of the funding for each state. That funding goes directly towards titles. Primarily, those titles impact students who are in minority groups. It also funds IDEA, or special education law, and it funds migrant and multi-language learner programs. That pretty much covers my entire student population as an alternative education provider in terms of students who receive some funding for those. I live in Oregon. Oregon will try to figure out a way to backfill that 10% by taking from their rainy day fund or robbing Peter to pay Paul. We won't necessarily probably feel the direct impacts of that until the next biennium, but that money has to come from somewhere. And so I'm hopeful that if that happens, that there will be enough people impacted that we rise up and try to figure out a way to mobilize or activate against these kind of directives. But in the meantime, we're going to try to find stopgaps. a clarifying biennium, that is the funding cycle for the government. So the state legislature puts together a budget. It's a 2-year budget. And so the new biennium just started. They're finalizing the next 2 years budget in July, and that will go through July of 2027. And so they are putting together this stuff based on a revenue forecast that includes funding from the federal government. And if that changes in the next couple of months, we're going to have to re-scramble in this state to figure out how to fund public education in the state of Oregon without that money.
I have a recent quote for you both from the Education Secretary, Linda McMahon. She says, President Trump is taking historic and common sense action to boost school safety standards. Disciplinary decisions should be based solely on students' behavior and actions. The executive order is called Reinstating Common Sense School Discipline Policies. The order removes the requirement for schools to analyze and address disciplinary practices that disproportionately affect students of certain racial or ethnic groups, a standard previously upheld under the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Schools are directed to implement discipline policies that are strictly behavior-based without any consideration of race, ethnicity, or other demographic factors. Educational institutions that continue to employ discipline policies, incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion principles may face federal funding repercussions. Now, here is the question, and this is for the two of you. With the recent elimination of the disparate impact considerations in school discipline under Project 2025, how do you think this will affect marginalized students, particularly Black, LGBTQ+, and disabled students when it comes to being disciplined? How can schools like ours protect students from being disproportionately punished, even when federal protections are being stripped away?
I could write a PhD thesis on this, and I might actually. 2 things. Let me organize my thoughts. The short-sightedness of this statement, of this executive order, is mind-blowing to me. It completely discounts, doesn't even consider what the definition of discipline is. What is the purpose of school discipline? Why do we discipline kids? For me, and from philosophically, discipline comes from the word disciple. Human beings make mistakes. Disciple, to teach. It's an opportunity for students to learn. Corporal punishment, exclusionary discipline is not an opportunity for students to learn unless it's a shame-based learning. You're going to be excluded from the community. Go get your act together and come back when you're ready. That is not how human beings work. I am under the philosophy that the more that we keep kids included in school, the more we surround our students with opportunities to learn from their mistakes, the behavior will change. The second thing is it completely discounts the fact that each individual student brings their home culture into the building. So we have students being disciplined for not raising their hand properly when that's a culturally specific expectation. And in home culture, maybe we interject, we interrupt, right? And so now we have kids being disciplined for having loud voices or using language that's quote unquote not appropriate for school. We have students being disciplined for showing up wearing clothes that are quote unquote not appropriate for school that are completely appropriate at home. So I think eliminating, just using a single measuring stick to try to determine how discipline should be meted out in an educational institution is completely short-sighted.
I think what is missing from this is where behavior comes from in the first place. That is a piece that's not being looked at in this equation. You know, what is driving behavior? Driving behavior comes from our thoughts and our feelings, and thus in turn, how we demonstrate these thoughts and these feelings. Again, as Jenny indicated, that this stick approach to quote unquote discipline does not address the thoughts and feelings that are driving the behavior in the first place. And that's very concerning to me. From a mental health standpoint, we address the feelings, we address the thoughts, the behaviors will change. And there is little investment as we're stepping closer and closer to this idea of, corporal punishment, this idea of dropping elbow. It eliminates the ability to look at those two pillars that lend to the behavior. In addition to the behavior that's bleeding out, we've all heard about like the prison to pipeline, and the school to pipeline or school to prison pipeline that exists. As we focus on particular behaviors, there's a direction that often leads to institutionalization for individuals that is definitely consistent with certain races, certain cultures. And that, school to prison pipeline exists within the current system that we had. And now we strip away even the layers of support and action to dismantle that pipeline. My worry is that this pipeline is going to get huge. And that's also something that weighs really heavily on my heart.
What gives you hope in this moment in our country?
That's an easy one for me because it's what gives me hope every day, not in just this moment. But I work with the most amazing students. I work with students who have overcome the most trauma, the most barriers, and they show up to school every day. Maybe not every day. They show up to school frequently, and they're here with direction, with purpose, with hope, in community, willing to share and connect. And if these are the human beings that are going to take the reins, that gives me hope.
Agreed. I 100% believe my hope comes from watching these individuals elevate themselves to a place where they're getting recognition for the skills they have, for the resiliency they have, for the bravery that they have. And I would say in addition to that, within my school, there's a great amount of trauma. And with price tag to trauma is, and this is like a horrible way of framing it, but we do get a reward from trauma in that we get tools that, if I've experienced a trauma and you have not, you might not have this tool in your toolbox. And so we've got an incredibly skilled group of individuals with some very unique tools that are meant to have purpose in this world. And I think that as we can teach these kids what to do with those tools, I talk to kids all the time about a hammer can build the biggest house, but it also can break the biggest window. How are you using your hammer? And oftentimes those hammers come from their own trauma experiences. And so having the opportunity to help them see that the things that have happened in their lives can actually serve a purpose that is beyond just someone who has not experienced those traumas is extremely hopeful. And it's exciting to see individuals who have incredibly skilled giftings getting recognition for those giftings.
Kaitlen, as a social worker, if you could send a message to the Trump administration making decisions about the future of education, what would you want them to hear?
That there's a difference between intent versus impact, that there are people hurting and there is no solution to addressing those hurts and those pains. And it's creating rifts in community and tearing apart community in ways that will interfere with healing.
I just think, make America great again. We've had the same public school system essentially that we've had for the last 70 years. We say we value education in this country. There is much evidence to the contrary. And as we were talking before we got started, it's not a civil right. Education is not guaranteed by the Bill of Rights or the Constitution in this country, which tells you exactly how much we prioritize it. So when you talk about making America great again, whatever that means, isn't that about focusing on the next generation? Why aren't we trying to work to improve our system rather than dismantle it? And to have, an administration that so clearly does not value public education and it values individual money more than anything is scary, to say the least.
Well, I want to thank you two for joining me today on this podcast. I have found it to be very powerful, insightful, and motivating. And anyone that's going to be listening to this are going to realize that the two of you are bringing your greatest and your best to your students, and I thank you for that.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Red Pens and Red Flags. This podcast series samples multiple public education professionals from different roles in schools. This includes teachers, administrators, special education, paraprofessionals, and language specialists.